afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Legal Meets the Cultural. We're excited that you're here with us and a part of our show every Wednesday, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for sharing the show with your friends and colleagues who are connected to you. We are literally, I have to count down, gentlemen. We have over 50 plus shows in the can, so that needs a round of applause because we've been here holding it down with our two legal experts. So I thank you for being a part of our audience and a part of our family. We have a lot to talk about today, as usual. I know some of you were viewing some things that were hot in the media, but we have some other news and information to get to that our two legal experts will be breaking down for us. But let me let them say hello to you themselves. Over to you, Mr. Royce Russell, Esquire.
Welcome, everybody. And as the day is long, we are here and we're here to provide the information that's necessary to our community. So hopefully we'll provide information today where we can get a sense of where the culture and the legal meets and stay hold to your seats. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. And over to you, Senor Edward Pichado, Esquire.
Hola, buenas tardes, todo el mundo. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, mi gente. Nice to see you here today with us. Thank you for joining the broadcast. As usual, I believe you're going to find the information fulfilling, educational. So, stay tuned.
Absolutely. So let's get in it. I mean, a lot in the news culturally. We will be acknowledging the 100th anniversary of Tulsa and those who watched the CNN special, and there's some other documentaries that have been popping up around where we are with that. There's some issues going on in the world that are dealing with another community when it comes to hate crimes. And what does that really mean? Where are the legal parts that we need to know about as a community? And, I think as recently as yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, there was another attack, like these random attacks are happening. And a 55-year-old was knocked out in an unprovoked attack in New York's Chinatown. And this was reported today. And they said that this man was arrested. He was 48. A resident of Manhattan. He got one count of an assault as a hate crime, and assault and criminal possession of controlled substance in a connection with an unprovoked attack, according to the officials. Let's see if we can see what happened.
Lord Jesus, there you go.
And he tried to act like, he was claiming, why did you hit me? That's what he said literally after he hits this woman.
And he's standing there as if like,
like
I had nothing to do with it. What's interesting about the article and what you said to us, Stace, and reported by way of, this illustration is that this gentleman is 48 years of age, right? And we have seen in time where these type of hate crimes, type of attack on elderly or other culturally or sexually orientated or gender type of display of hate happens, and it usually happens with a younger sector, right? It rarely happens somebody who's in their 50s, in their 40s, who's been on the earth for a period of time. And here, this is what we have. So, I mean, in view of this, we would like to shed the light on, hey, look, what's the penalties? What is the actual law if you get caught doing so? Because, it is not nice. And you're talking to somebody for the listeners and the viewers that are first time, viewers and listeners, as a former prosecutor and deputy of the bias unit in Bronx County, which dealt with hate crimes back in the early 90s, the penalties are stiff. There's nothing to play with when it comes to that. And to be honest with you, going to trial is probably not your best avenue to take when you're dealing with these type of cases.
Well, what I would say in terms of the penalties is that just for, the audience, back in 2000, the state legislature here in New York passed the Hate Crimes Act of 2000. And basically what that law did was the existing offenses that are on the books if they are proven to have been committed based on, racial bias or otherwise, religious, sexual orientation, national origin, ancestry, all those things, if they were committed in whole or substantially in part based on, that level of discrimination, then what ends up happening is that the offense is moved one category up. So what do I mean by that? So if you have what would otherwise be a Class A misdemeanor, it then goes up to a Class C felony, and if it's a Class C felony, it goes up to a D, et cetera, except for when the specified offense is a Class B or A1 felony. And in that case, simply the term of the sentence is then enhanced. And, where, of course, at that level, we're talking about, stuff like, murder or attempted murder, that sort of thing. But, it's what sometimes is considered in the law to be considered a penalty enhancer. So let's say this assault here, whatever it would normally be deemed, it's ratcheted up one category. And when you ratchet it up, that next category, of course, we're talking about more years in terms of exposure at sentencing.
Right.
So, so that's what we're talking about here. And certainly this individual, deserves, whatever they have coming to them. I think it's pretty clear that this person was targeted because of their Asian descent. Of course, the prosecutor is going to have to figure out a way to prove that. It shouldn't be an insurmountable task, because there's been a disturbing number of these incidents occurring. They've been well documented, well publicized, extremely unfortunate. One of the disturbing aspects of many of these incidents is that they're being committed by individuals of color. And I just, for the life of me, the only thing I can think of there on a cultural level is going back to Spike Lee, Do the Right Thing. I don't know if you remember the scene, because in that movie, Spike, master filmmaker Spike, goes to extreme lengths to talk about all of the racial divisions that exist in most urban communities. And so you got, I don't know if you remember the scene where the old gentleman is sitting across the street and they're watching the Korean grocer, and they're complaining about how this individual is able to come to the country and all of a sudden open a business. And then the other one argues and said, "Man, you could have started your own business. You too damn lazy." And they're kind of going back and forth, and unfortunately, we talk about this stuff, we touch upon it, but all of this stuff is seething underneath, and it seems to bubble to the surface when stuff like, because of course, right, this stuff is related to the pandemic, right? And so, you got the chief racist in the White House talking about the Kung Fu flu, and now people are embracing this level of discrimination and blaming, Asians uniformly, no matter where they're from, be they from China, Vietnam, because Asians aren't just one category. They don't even speak the same language, depending on what part of Asia they come from. And yet and still, you got people putting them all in one box and blaming them for something that they could not have at all possibly played a role in. I doubt that this woman worked in a lab in Wuhan and had anything to do with anything. I mean, it's
well,
just unfortunate.
I think some part of what you say is dead on spot, and then I think there's another part. The other part is that it's unfortunate that some of these incidences that have been on the news, and once again, we always bring up Byron Allen and controlling our narratives, is usually showing a person of color, African American or Latino diaspora, hitting someone or attacking someone that is Asian. And we know that it just doesn't stop and start there, right? There's a bigger scope on that. Black folks are not the only folks running around doing this thing. And even when you start to talk about the conspiracy that President 45 put in the air, I don't even know that folks are taking that to heart as we tail out of the pandemic, not in the height of or in the middle of. Sometimes it becomes an act of where it's cool to do, or it becomes one of those copycat type of situations. But you've mentioned on a couple of things that will hopefully stop this in the mid tracks. You talked about the New York State hate crime. And, I just want to give some air to how states are replicating this. This is just not New York. In New Jersey, they have the same thing. And I'll read that statute and then go back to what you call the bump up. In New Jersey, they state hate crimes, any unlawful act done in a manner that evidence an intention to victimize an individual on the account of his or her actual or perceived. And that's where you get to the Asian, right? You say Asian is a wide diaspora, right? You think someone is from China, you think someone is from, and they could be from the Philippines, they could be from some other place, right? So perceived race, religion, sexual orientation, ethnicity, or disability, right? And so that's how they that's how they define it in New Jersey. And as you stated, in New York, it's the same type of language. One thing I left out in New Jersey that I did not see in the New York statute is in New Jersey, they also talked about sexuality that one claims or one chooses to be. So when you talk about transgender, when you talk about gay, lesbian factors or people in our society, it also goes to the choosing. And as you stated before, and just having people really zero in on what the bump up is. A misdemeanor is a year or less in jail. You participate in a hate crime, that now becomes an e-felony. E-felony could mean probation, but most likely it's 1.5 to 3 years in jail, right? And I just want to make sure people understand that there's two parts to this, right? There must also be an unlawful act that goes with it. That has to be the underlying thing. So if I just call somebody a very unflattering word that indicates that I may have a bias, and I'm just going to use this as an example: homo, faggot, chink eyes, cracker, just using those as example. If I just say that, then you're not in the hate crime area. And we'll talk a little later. You might be in danger of hate speech. You might be in danger of something else. But that alone doesn't put you in the hate crime area. What puts you in the hate crime area if you say that and then you snatch the bag of chips, or you snatch the gold chain, or you punch somebody in the face, or you harass them and stalk them, and you, wherever they go, you're calling them this hateful speech, this hateful name. Then you start to encroach into, the area of hate crime where you can actually be charged. And there's a big difference, like in New Jersey, 4th degree crime, which is a felony, 18 months. You do something crazy that where the prosecutor can prove the hate crime, you can go from 4th to 1st and look at 15 to 35. In New York, you can go from a B and you're looking at 5 to 15, and next thing you know, you're looking 15 to 20. Just based upon adding the words with the actions that gets you there.
Well, I do want to say that and inform the audience that the specified offenses that are subject to hate crime enhancement are specified in New York law. And I know criminal mischief is in there. I'm not sure if menacing is in there.
No, harassment is in there.
Harassment is in there.
Criminal mischief is in there, and destruction of property. And so let's back up. Harassment. Harassment is that kind of stalking, walking around. That could be, and they actually have a stalking statute that deals with that as well. So it could be the actual stalking. It could be stalking sometimes, which we can describe as harassment. The criminal mischief could be breaking someone's property.
And the reason why I wanted to mention that is just to kind of say that let's differentiate between the simple statement, but if the statement is accompanied by some threatening behavior that may not touch, but is certainly like, yeah, you this, you that, that can rise to that level of harassment. And then, subject you under certain circumstances. In terms of, comparing New York to New Jersey, let me just read out, because here also it says a person commits a hate crime when he or she commits a specified offense, and the area of law that this is Article 485 of the penal law intentionally selects the person against whom the offense is committed or intended to be committed in whole or in substantial part because of a belief or perception regarding the race, color, national origin, ancestry, gender, religion, religious practice, age, disability, or sexual orientation of a person, regardless of whether the belief or perception is correct.
Right.
And that's subsection A, B, intentionally commits the act or acts constituting the offense, and it reads the same, regardless of whether the belief or perception is correct. So just to, for point of information, does include sexual orientation, and there is an allowance for the belief or perception to not be ultimately correct. So let's say, crime is committed. Oh, you're Chinese, the person is Philippine, you're still guilty. Doesn't matter. Japanese and you call them Chinese, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if you're committing the offense, committed in whole or substantial part, because this is empowering prosecutors to, there may have been some other motivation, but if race or one of these discriminatory classes is the substantial motivation, you seeing the judge, buddy.
And here is what's critical, right? You say specify acts, right? And so I don't want our viewers and listeners to like have to do a whole lot of research on this, right? Specify act goes from a simple harassment, which could be a violation in most instances, a violation, not a crime, but in this case would become a crime, all the way to something like murder. So basically, although they say specified acts, it's damn near every act that you can commit in the criminal penal law. I mean, that's the reality of it. I mean, it goes from first degree assault, second degree, third degree, first degree rape, second degree, third degree, you name it, it goes on. It's not like it's 5 or 6 of them and like all the rest you don't have to worry about. It is almost the whole statute. And what is interesting in New Jersey, and in reference to the hate crime, they make it a point to tie it to what they call the bias crimes in general, right? And so when you talk about the unlawful act, like we said, it can be harassment, it could be criminal mischief. Discrimination component is what elevates the unlawful act to the crime. And all hate crimes in New Jersey are tied to what they call this bias intimidation statute. And basically what it does is the prosecutor is forced to show the bias, and based upon that and the underlying act, they proportion whether the upgrade and how high an upgrade it should be. Now, what do we mean by proportion? I snatch somebody's bag of chips and I give me those bag of chips, you chink, right? All right. Seems like a hate crime, right? The elite New Jersey is a little bit more sensitive that we're not just going to take the words, take the actions, and automatically fit in the category. We're going to take the words, we're going to take the actions, and we're going to try to understand it to a degree. Are you grabbing the chips because you believe that person is a chink, or are you grabbing the chips and you saying, "Let me give me those chips, chink," and you saying it as an afterthought? They write that into the statute, right? So there's no kind of way to like say that, try to overcharge this, right? Because sometimes people speak in terminology that's not reflective of their necessary hate, right? They may be speaking in terminology like, we know we hate the use of the N word in a variety of ways. And so if someone is using that, the statute, at least in New Jersey, tries to force the prosecutor and takes in consideration the circumstance where something could be said that is not flattering, but is not totally related to it being a hate crime. And so you have to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. And that sometimes could be difficult.
And that's, I believe, where the New York statute uses that term in whole or in substantial part to deal with that part of it, because there has to be, a certain level of it being the reason of the intention, not just some sort of byproduct of it. So, but go ahead, Doctor.
Yeah, I just have to insert, and I appreciate that you all are breaking it down so we understand what it is, especially with the rise of what we're seeing with the Asian hate crimes. But what happened to all the hate crimes? Did anything that happened to us ever get?
Yeah, well, I knew we were going to go there.
I need to understand how that works for Black people, because it don't seem like we have in large number been able to have any cases on those sorts of hate crimes that have happened to us over the years. So I'm just curious, for our legal experts, when we talk about the legal meeting the cultural, inquiring minds want to know.
Well, I can tell you that there's no place like last place, right? I mean, that's what comes to my mind. We've seen hate crimes enacted on us. We've seen hate crimes. We can go back as far as KKK and move all the way up to, Tulsa, move all the way up to what we see in marches and protests as far as Black Lives Matter. We can hit every single decade, and we can elicit, an act or two or some type of interview where, we get the brunt of the stick. That just goes to the inequities of the justice system. I mean, and that goes to a little bit of the lack of having a voice or being willing to put this out there to say exactly what you just said. Wait a minute, what's going on here? Like, are we spreading this evenly, or how are we doing this? And that's advocacy, on the social level.
Oh yeah. I mean, listen, at the end of the day, one of the big issues here, of course, is that, for instance, here in New York City, you have a new mayor, right? That mayor gets to appoint their police commissioner. That appointment usually also involves a conversation on priorities, right? Then you have, this power dynamic issue, and whether or not police are going to use their discretion to properly look at whether or not a crime that has occurred deserves to be, that the person deserves to be arrested for a hate crime, and then have that prosecutor evaluate it from that lens, and then actually charge. And then you have the judge who has to decide. And then ultimately, if the case goes to jury and it's a jury trial instead of a bench trial, then a jury. But a lot of this has small advocacy power dynamics that come into play. Now, I don't know if we're ready to talk about it.
And let me stop you there. Let me just stop you there, and let me insert in the same thought that you've had, right? What made me stop you and your comments brought my eyes to the proof necessary, right? So Dr. Grant, to what you're saying, Ed, to what you're saying, it's about implementation and priorities, right? Who is going to be prioritized? Is a certain community going to get that eye? Like we've seen over COVID, right? There was a big push to make sure that communities of color got that eye, right? Because people were advocating, saying we're not getting the same treatment, we're not getting the same healthcare. So that same type of eye, discretionary, prioritizing that Ed is talking about, who's the inspector, who's the commissioner, what are the politics behind being the mayor, and then on the prosecution level, what can we prove or not prove? And this is where I wanted to put a pin in it and say that based upon the statute, you have to prove, and I'll read it, you have to prove the proof of the race or ethnicity, sexual orientation, all those things, disability, all those things for which you could be charged with a hate crime of the assailant, victim, or both. This assailant and the victim does not by itself constitute legal sufficient evidence to satisfy the burden of the state to show that a hate crime existed. So just because you have a black person hitting an Asian person, or a white person attacking a black person, or a black person attacking a white person, I know we may say, oh, that's common sense. That doesn't automatically mean that it is a hate crime. You're right. It doesn't automatically mean it's a hate crime. You actually need that verbal conversation that takes it over the top. Just the difference of the distinguishing features of the two is not going to do it. And you be surprised. Some of that is hard to prove. I mean, getting into someone's mental state is hard to prove. Like on the surface, unless there is language that speaks to this individual who's 48 years old who hit this other woman, I know we could say, well, what was the other reason that he hit her? Why else did he do it? But you have to prove. It's not why else. Why else is not going to get you conviction. You have to prove that this person was illustrating, and the illustration is more verbal with the actions that cause it. And then let me just also say that when we talk about hate crimes, what we forget is that also there's an age sensitivity. In New York, if a crime happens to someone that's over the age of, let me get that right, 60 years or older, that can also be brought in that category. And what we kind of gloss over and we don't really focus on is disability. You know, you can commit a crime against someone that's disabled, and that also could be categorized as a hate crime. Now, you have to have some other elements, but let's don't overlook that they're in the group, and let's don't overlook that age is in the group.
And I think normally when it comes to that, and you speak to something important here, because prosecutors also look at patterns. So let's say that you have a repeated pattern of attacking old folks, right? You're committing these crimes. Or women. Let's say your thing is, I'm robbing these women. That's all you doing. Boom, there you go. That rises to that level. If this individual attacked this Asian woman and is found to have attacked somebody else, then you can argue that, hey, listen, the discrimination, the bias, the hate part of it is proven there. So let's not just look at verbal speech. We're also looking at patterns here.
And you mentioned that, and it seemed like we're riding on the same treadmill here. I don't know who's jogging in front, who's jogging in back, but I appreciate you bringing up these points here.
That thing ain't long enough, bro. I'm scared I'm gonna fall off.
Don't worry, if I got your back, man, I'm pushing you. Don't worry, if I got your back, I'm pushing you up to the front. It just can't fit all three of us unless it's a Peloton or one.
Oh, what?
You heard about that, right? The legal and the culture all day. You know what I mean? But what is interesting about what you said, you talked about speech. I did a little research in the area when we were talking about hate crime, knowing that we were going to speak about it. And I came across where it was stated that when it came down to hate speech, there appears to be no real legal, and I'm looking down at my notes, no real legal definition under United States law. No definition for evil ideas or unpatriotic speech that can be criminalized in and of itself, right? So you can say what you want when you want, and that's freedom of speech, and that's
First Amendment
all the way. But it's when someone says, well, as a defense, I just use the N-word because it was the N-word. They use it, right? If someone's white and they say they use it, I use it, it's in all the records. How do you tie that to a case?
How you tie
that to the case, right? It's in every record. They said, I said, they use it no matter, whether you're talking about Latinos, whether you're talking about African Americans, whether you're talking about whites, it's all over. So I punch them in the face and I call them the N-word. Now, because I'm white, now that means that I go down?
Oh man! Well, that's
why we defense counsels, brother.
That's where you get the whole and the substantial part. And listen, I'll be honest with you. I've had to deal with this issue in another context, more employment related than anything. Years ago, I had to represent this Latino gentleman who, grew up all his life, in around, African Americans, Black people, and and the use of the N-word, of course, is ubiquitous in such communities. Not so much for the racial part of it, but simply that that's a term that's used. And so apparently that gentleman and an African-American supervisor got into it, I believe, over him doing some sort of overtime when others weren't being asked to do the same. And the N-word, well, you ain't asking them other.
There we go. And there we go.
And he was looking at getting fired. We went to arbitration. I had to convince, the white arbitrator of the cultural dynamics surrounding the use of the term and him not really using it as a racial epithet
No, you didn't. I
had to.
Hey, I'm dying slowly.
He was a good defense counsel.
Well, well, listen, I was able to keep his job because at the end of the day, what was said did not have a racial component to it. This, there were other. This supervisor was basically using this and kind of setting up this cultural dynamic. Oh, well, he's Latino and he said this when
it really wasn't the case, huh?
Yeah, when you know good and well that Latinos and Black people, they live together in the hood together, and that it's just not the same. And luckily, I was able to convince the arbitrator, and we kept the man working. But
the reason why I bring it up is that it could be just that simple, right? It could be just that, right? I mean, like, I don't mean anything by it, but you say it, and there we go. Space, right?
And it's something to be aware of too when we talk about how loosely the younger generation uses certain terms. So they need to understand that something that seems like it's just urban vernacular could end you up in a situation. I think about that commercial. We have a situation, like that can happen if you use the wrong word. So I want to pause for a minute to shout out Richard. Thank you for always being here. He wanted to shout you out, Ed, on your gear. So this is our commercial break, since you are proudly repping for New York Knicks. But as we continue with the show, this was enlightening for people to understand what the difference is: hate speech, hate crime, what's really in the law, what's not in the law, because we see we're living in like a powder keg of times. Like, there's so many things going on. And I was really shocked to see that a 48-year-old did the attack. I mean, no one should be attacking anybody, but I'm like, 48 and you're attacking just randomly? That had to be some mental health issues. And I think the article talks a little bit more about what's going on.
I'm sure his attorney's going to argue that all day, every day, that there's something behind door number one. But as we transition to the other part of our show, we also, in the same room, in the same dining room area, is the hate crimes as it relates to property, right? We talked about criminal mischief, right? And that's saying you could be charged with hate crime when it comes down to destruction of certain property, and whether that is defacing, a synagogue, throwing a rock, doing what the article says right here, right? Writing a swastika, I can't even say it. How you say it?
Swastika.
Swastika, right. There you go, swastika. Let me get a little bit of the juice. The swastika, on a piece of property. And then we have this, which is just really ridiculous.
Yeah, so, here we have a situation where this white paint is put all over to cover what would otherwise say Black Wall Street Gallery, meaning that's what the neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that was burned to the ground. That's what it was called. It was called Black Wall Street because it was a community of very prosperous African Americans who had their own businesses, from banks to barbershops.
You name it.
Surgeons.
Investment
Yes. And in fact, many of the individuals who ended up having to escape with their lives, apparently many of them ended up in other cities, including Chicago, Illinois, which has a very well documented, long-standing Black upper middle class, and they became the foundation of that class in that city, as well as a number of other cities. And people should also keep in mind that there were several other communities like this throughout the United States that met similar fates, because the whites in surrounding communities were extremely jealous or otherwise upset that these black people had prospered in the way that they did, despite the circumstances here. But getting back to this here, one of the things that struck me about this is that apparently, according to the gallery owner, he's saying that police get there and they're like, oh, we don't know if this fits the bill as a hate crime. And it's like, whoa, wait a minute, hold on a second. Why not?
Because it's not a rock being thrown against a synagogue. It's not spray painting, a SWAT sticker on some other, religious entity. It is concerning black folks. And because it's concerning black folks, as we stated earlier, the implementation laws are on the book, and there are things that you have to take the laws and you have to implement them. You have to carry them out. And if you have people that are not willing to do their job, you have exactly what you're getting ready to describe. I don't know if it really fits it. I can't really, what can't you tell?
Yeah, like, listen, here you have clear criminal damage to property with a discriminatory intent behind it in whole or substantial part because of a belief or, well, in this case, it would be B, intentionally commits the act in whole or substantial part because of a belief regarding the race, or color, national origin, etc., ancestry. The motivation clearly here was to affect this recognition of this very severe incident that occurred back in 1921. That was, I mean, I believe, Dr. Grant, you were mentioning the documentary on CNN earlier this week. For those who don't know about this incident, it requires, or I would invite, close examination, a viewing of that documentary and several others that have been come out during the years, and to read about it.
Absolutely.
This was and listen, labels are everything, because for many years this was referred to as a riot, and now, refreshingly enough, people are actually calling it a massacre. The Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre of 1921, because that's what it was.
And this goes right back to controlling the media and the narrative that is put out there. I mean, like, this is the full circle. No matter where you go and what you say, it comes back to that same thing. Who labeled it a riot?
Absolutely.
What was the riot about?
And that's what they touch on. And yes, to our documentary on the History Channel as well, Richard, thank you for sharing that, because they're survivors of this. So it's one, controlling your narrative, is two, being able to capture the stories of those who were a living eyewitness. And there was a sister who actually started documenting years ago from eyewitnesses what happened, how they had to flee. They were kids, some of them a little bit older than that. And, they burnt down houses. The surgeon, one of the leading surgeons, they called him out of his house, and, he's trying to talk to them. He's trying to figure out. And the crowd was just so angry. A young white guy in the crowd shot and killed him. And, it's when you hear story after story after story, it's like reliving this continuous nightmare of our experience in this country. And there was a track that was in between the two sides of town, and they couldn't stand seeing that this was a wealthy, affluent neighborhood. And some of them were domestic workers. They worked on the other side. They came back and they pooled their money right back into the community. That's how the community was able to prosper. They were able to recycle dollars. They were able to really have a self-sufficient community and a very upper middle class situation. Like, it was the people who had resources for education, and the Dreamland Theater, I believe it was, where they would go and have all of the artists that would come and perform, and everyone was dressed to the nines. We know how to dress. Like, it was a whole, as the kids would say now, it was a whole vibe. And that vibe was burnt down to the ground after one incident that they ended up forgetting about, that this gentleman was going into an elevator. He apparently tripped or whatever happened. He ended up touching the shoulder, which ripped the dress of the one woman who was operating an elevator.
Is
And
that
then
is that factual as to what?
that's
as to
what
happened?
it's the conjecture. Like everyone is trying to go through, and then there was some additional research that was done because he was eventually released, but it set off, it was the powder keg that set off what happened. And they started putting out, talking about narrative, and I'm leading up to why I'm mentioning that. They started putting out the narrative that this black man tried to rape a white woman in the elevator. And that's what caused everything to start boiling and boiling and boiling. And then they started deputizing white people from other places to come in and basically be a part of what destroyed. And they had airstrikes. So they had one of the elders.
That is what makes it unbelievable,
airstrikes.
right? Unbelievable, right? If you want to talk about a riot, I get that. You want to talk about, we had riots in Newark, we had riots in Chicago. I don't recall those riots where you had airstrikes, right? Like, what we doing with the airstrikes?
Right? Except on the MOVE compound in
right.
Where
Exactly.
they dropped a bomb.
Right. So we know that is directly related to race, directly related to ethnicity, directly related to the culturalism and the well-being of our people. Nothing else, nothing more. And when we talk about reparations and we talk about where to start, and a shout out to Evanston, Chicago, Evanston, Illinois, who have a reparation program built in their taxes. When we talk about that, who should get, who shouldn't get, we can look at incidences like this and just say that's trackable. Like, that's trackable. Let's start with that group, right? And then let's go over here to this group,
The descendants that are still alive, and the descendants of the descendants. So it's not like it's hard to track. And they went as far as to go to the cemetery to look at areas that were marked as possible mass graves. So the first excavation that they did, unfortunately, they didn't find what they were looking for, but it's a huge property. And there were white people as well, remembering as children what happened, and they were dumping Black people in boxes. He worked on one of these plots. So it's not like this is just all conjecture, it's make believe, because we know how narratives can get twisted. But there is a group on the ground that is continuing to push for the real information to really get the reparations for the minimum, the descendants of these families.
Yes.
Who owned and were thriving. So, it's a continuous conversation. But if you don't know your history, if you don't know what has happened, then you're bound to repeat the same mistakes. So that's why it's so important that programs like ours and others who are giving voice to stories that have never been told, information that some people don't know about. Because I honestly believe there's some people out here who are really scratching their heads like, wait, what? I thought America was just perfect and beautiful.
Well, there's some people scratching their heads because they never even heard of Tulsa in 1921. And that's the real head scratcher. And then there's some people that are scratching their heads because they don't believe that they live in a world where they can actually be charged that as well. Like, no, I'm not going to be charged that's above me or that's beneath me. And the reality is that you could. And there's another head scratcher that these things will happen to us day in and day out unless we put the pressure, whether it's election or whether it's just being advocates in and of ourselves, to put the pressure out there to say, no, this should be labeled a hate crime. This should be labeled a hate crime. Some of these wrongful death cases with police officers, this should be labeled some hate crimes there. What are we doing? What's the catalyst behind this? The excessive force, what's the catalyst behind it? And we need to start to explore how we broaden that box and how we look at things.
No, absolutely. I mean, we need to. I mean, in terms of some people being ignorant or not, I'd like to point out that, and it's well documented that for many years, that community in Tulsa refused to teach their children anything about what had occurred, and it took the activists to start saying, "Wait a minute, we need to remember that this happened. We need to bring this to light," because in many cases, you have individuals who will say, "Oh, why do you want to talk about that? That was so long ago," as if it occurred in the Jurassic age. and not seeing, as was mentioned, generational wealth destroyed. When we look at our communities, these communities didn't end up this way overnight. They were the product of generational racism, of people being deprived of resources or being actively swindled. Like, a lot of people don't know that there was a bank that was set up for freed slaves right after the Civil War that was basically allowed to be looted by speculators, by the person who was in charge and who had a fiduciary duty of guarding those funds who were collected from these freed slaves. People don't talk about that. You know, they like to talk about this narrative of folks being less than industrious and not having business acumen and being lazy, and that's so far from the truth. I mean, there's an active history of people of color in this country being prevented from fully engaging in the financial system of this country, from being able to open up certain businesses. Certain industries have been actively closed to us. The other day, I was reading about the level of discrimination that takes place in the assessing of property before a sale. You know, because what happens is the banks will send somebody out there whose job it is to look at the value of your home and say, okay, this is how much this home is worth. And there was an article about this black woman who had to have her white friend or neighbor stand in for her as the owner when the person came to assess the value, and also had to actively remove any signs that this home was owned by a person of color in order to get the value raised up. To get the maximum value. Because the banks, all these institutions are part of the discrimination. It's a system. It's a system that you know, the home in that neighborhood is valued less than it would be in a white area. Or if that white person is living in that black area, they get their home valued higher than their black neighbors. This actively happens. And you will hear after the fact, oh no, I use a neutral system to assess the value of these homes. And wait a minute, why is it that this is happening? Well, I don't know. You know, well, like, you know,
that's a broader.
I have black friends. What do you mean? You know, I would never engage in discrimination.
And you're gonna be sitting next to a couple watching the Dr. Grant, let me just add one thing, because there is a gray area here, I believe, or let me not say gray area, something that we need to be cognizant of. When we talk about hate crimes, and I may have mentioned it earlier and I didn't have the right words, but now I'm looking at my notes. And not only does it include sexual orientation, it says gender identity or expression. And that's critical, because we know what this month is, right? I mean, we're in June, right? We know that, you know, that I don't know if they still use the word gay pride or what have you. We know that we're in this month. We know that we have an evolving society where we have transgender, where we have binary, you know, labeling or identification, and to include gender identity or expression, you know, shows how we're evolving, but also opens up the landscape that people really have to be sensitive to what's going on around them. Now, the actor, the assailant, may not think that their act was just a crime. I was going to snatch that chain one way or the other. But if there's a rash of attacks on transgender people, or, you know, people that fit some other category, you could wind up in that catch-22, and we need to be mindful of that. I mean, that's important.
Persecuted.
That's important.
And you really have to know. I mean, obviously, we wish we could live in a world where everybody treated everybody kindly and, you know, didn't cause any crime. But when these things happen, being careful how legislation is written and what happens as a result. Hey, Kevin, thank you for tuning in and being a part of the show. I do want to, he said, we are 3/5 a person, even in real estate. That unfortunately is something to think about, and the gender nomenclature is fluid as well. Yeah, there's a whole lot, but I want to circle back to Tulsa just really quickly, because the mayor, the current mayor, GT Bynum, that's out in Tulsa, he had
No, I thought you was going to say. I thought you was going to say Mayor De Blasio, because he just talking way too much. But go ahead.
No,
yeah, please.
talk about him.
Anything with black folks in another state, he got something to say, right? But black folks in this state, he ain't got this.
No, anyway, I'll talk about GT Bynum. So GT Bynum, he was instrumental in having them start to open up and dig into the truth, because he said he didn't know about it. And he said, I never learned about this in school. And, you know, two of his grandparents were mayors or elected officials there in Tulsa. He's proud to be from Tulsa. And he said he was embarrassed to find out about this information and that it wasn't taught to him and he didn't know. So I do want to give just a little shout out to him and his team, because they could have gone a different direction with allowing this to come up to the forefront. But he's been very vocal in supporting that, you know, it was wrong and that the history needed to really be told. So, you know, there are accounts when you know, you were just talking about how things get switched and the narrative. And he just basically was very transparent and saying, I had no idea this was even, it didn't sound true. I didn't believe it until I found out and, you know, got some additional information. So just hearing that he publicly said that in a press conference was a little refreshing, knowing that there's so many who are still in our country spinning all sorts of false narratives. And he was giving space as a mayor to be able to open up dialogue, information, and even go as far to get the authorization moving with excavating these graveyards.
And just a shout out. There should be a shout out real quick to Russell Westbrook, who spent most of his career at Oklahoma City, Oklahoma Thunder, who also shed light on this issue way before today, putting his money where his mouth is. Professional sports, standing up and advocating.
And LeBron was an executive producer.
That's right.
This Dreamland that happened on CNN. But Senor, over to you.
Like, a lot of people don't realize that there was a substantial population of slaves here in New York, and in particular in New York City, and that there is an African burial ground down by the courts in that area of Center Street, that
City Hall down there. Yep.
Yeah, that finally got its recognition, you know, about maybe 10 to 15 years ago. And it's a very beautiful monument there, because they discovered those remains while they were building that construction project there. And, you know, the activists came out and they were like, whoa, wait a minute, we got to do something. And there's also, I was involved in a project some years ago, maybe about 7 years ago, with an African burial ground that was found in Hunts Point, where they were able to locate a number of remains of our ancestors. And you know, I now that I think about it, that's something that I have to revisit to see how far those activists got in getting that recognized. And that all started when a teacher took his class on a class trip, I believe, to the Museum of the City of New York, and they started going through some records, and a child looked at a photo with a wooden cross and asked the teacher what that was, and eventually they found out that it was a burial site that was no longer recognized as that in modern day. And they did the research and they found out that, you know, it was a park and that there were absolutely no markings that our ancestors were buried underneath this thing. And, you know, eventually a technician was brought out to do some sort of investigation as to what was underneath in that ground, and that's when they spotted the remains, and they were pushing for recognition of that. And so there are many parts, even in our city here in New York City, and I'm sure a number of other communities, where our ancestors are underground, and were never recognized and given the recognition and had their burial sites desecrated.
Well, gentrification has its way. You'll never know anything because it's up and running. And you talked about, I think you said Prospect or Hunts Point. You know that
Hunts Point.
You know, for those who don't know New York, that is a prime real estate area. It was known for something else, but now is known for a place to live in, and hopefully those activists were able to preserve that piece of land.
We hope so. But as we close out the show, I want to close it out with a little good news because we are a strong people. We've survived the transatlantic slave trade and all the other injustices that we have experienced in the world. And we can still find ways to be a blessing even when people don't bless us. This is a cute story that I just love. This couple started hiding money inside baby supplies at Target to help families, you know, recalling their own struggle. They now have 3 of their own kids, and they said this was something that they just wanted to do to be a blessing. So they went out and would put it underneath the top lid of formula or stick it inside the Pampers or put it.
What city was this?
This was in LA.
Oh, okay. All right.
This was in LA. And they just really wanted to be nice and to be a blessing to African Americans, a couple that, you know, they can't go out and feed all the homeless and help everybody who's struggling, but they took it upon themselves to take $1,000 of their own money and disperse that to randomly bless those individuals who were going in and needed to pick up supplies for their children. So that's my Hope Springs Eternal moment as we close out the show, that from the ruins of what was intended for our people, we keep rising, we keep coming out stronger. We're learning how to reclaim what was stolen. We're using our voices. We're not staying on mute. And we have programs like this and others that are helping to tell our story. And I do want to congratulate LeBron and Westbrook and everybody else who has a certain capacity that makes the decision to put their money and invest it back into how we can make the next generation have a better experience than we have. So who knows where Speaking Legally will go next? Who knows if Byron Allen, you're listening in, we're ready to come and join you and be a part of what you have created. But we thank you all, Richard, Rolanda, Kevin, and everyone else who's catching the replay, #replay. We appreciate you and thank you for being here today. I'll let my co-hosts give their final words and we'll see you next week. It's the first week of June. Can you believe it? We're already in June. We're countdown to Juneteenth. So there'll be a lot more recognition. It's being recognized in the state of New York officially. Assemblywoman Alicia Hyman here in my area is one of those who made sure that got passed in the New York State Assembly. So now that people are finding out about Juneteenth, they're like, what's that? More information, more knowledge. We pray that is what gets disseminated so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past and our children's children know what strong stock they come from. So over to you, Royce Russell Esquire. We'll start with you, and then Senor Preciado, you can close us out.
I just want everybody to make sure they stay protected, stay empowered, and stay blessed. And thank you for joining.
Keep rising to the top. While my mom said, give it all you got, give it all you got.
Oh, Lord, you got the Royce bug. All right, so we want a follow-up on Hunts Point. So we'll put that in the queue. Thank you, Jose, for asking that question.
My man Jose, love you, brother.
Yeah, we'll turn that over to our legal experts, and we'll get a show in on that, get some research done, and bring it to you, all of the love to the BX. Bye for now, and enjoy the rest of your day, family.